Okay, now in the prior video I talked a lot about dishonest language, and there are a couple of other excellent examples of that beyond socialist or liberal or leftist, and beyond fascist or conservative or right wing. And one of those issues that is currently obscured by incredibly dishonest language is the so-called gun control issue, and or the gun rights issue. And just to be clear, there are technically only individual property rights, because rights, the definition of rights as it pertains to this conversation, the definition of individual rights is a right is a valid legal claim, okay? And if you have a valid legal claim to something in material reality, then that is a property right, okay? So as long as we're talking about material reality here, we should pay attention to the fact that words don't always refer to something that actually exists, right? There can be terms that are essentially fraudulent and that only describe fictions or only describe an idea that does not exist in material reality. And one of those ideas is gun control. And in the sense that it is always used, it means restrictions on the ownership of firearms. And so it's always a good idea to point this out and to ask people very clearly if they mean by gun control restrictions on the property right, the right to own firearms, the right to own and or carry firearms. And obviously the firearm is no use for self-defense unless you can carry it, and not even potentially useful for self-defense unless you can carry it. So a shorter way to reveal that the term gun control is actually a propaganda tool, and it's a way of pushing the political discussion in a certain direction, is just ask anybody who uses the term, do you mean gun chaos or slave control? Because if they're talking about guns and they're talking about control, you do not get more control by restricting the private right to own or carry a firearm. More control does not result from that. It gives the police more power, and because the police have more power, they become bolder and more aggressive, and they realize that there is less and less of a chance for anyone to resist any illegitimate enforcement of illegitimate laws. So there can be illegitimate enforcement of legitimate laws, such as by, like if the police in a certain country were in fact racist, then they might enforce the laws against murder or robbery only against certain people, and that would act as a statistical pressure disfavoring any other sort of racial minority or group. And there can also be illegitimate enforcement of illegitimate laws. In fact, all enforcement of illegitimate laws is illegitimate, and so the police then become emboldened to enforce illegitimate laws when there are restrictions on the right to own and carry firearms. And when they become emboldened, this does not result in increased control or increased order in society. It actually results in chaos. And we know this because gun ownership restrictions, firearm ownership restrictions, have preceded every major democide, that's a mass murder by government, and every major genocide that has occurred in the last 118 years. So you can see it even with the law in Rwanda, in the most recent genocide, that stripped the Tutsi minority of their legal right. Allegedly, it stripped them of their legal right, their valid legal claim to own even a machete for self-defense. And so even the you know, machetes, rakes, anything that could be used as a weapon was confiscated from the Tutsi minority, and then they were summarily massacred by people who were aligned, let me let this car go by here, by people who were aligned with the Hutu power government. And the Hutu power government, of course, increased the propaganda against the Tutsi minority, and the police enforced the genocide. So police officers cannot be counted on to enforce only legitimate laws. And anytime that you have the police enforcing any illegitimate law, that's your signal that they are willing to enforce every single illegitimate law. Like, if they're willing to enforce one illegitimate law, think about what that means about the psychology of the police officer. That means that the psychology of the police officer is okay with essentially destroying someone's life or escalating to an unreasonable extent any sort of illegitimate law, because every single law can be escalated. That's a fact of the criminal sanction, the way that our current government operates. Not the way it's designed, but the way it currently operates. It's not much different than any other government anywhere else in the world at this point. So, if you're arbitrarily targeted by a police officer enforcing an illegitimate law, then you know, you could say that that is introducing chaos into your life. And if this repeats itself on a grand scale, if this happens to lots and lots of people, then you can say that that there's increased chaos. And if you're talking about the role that firearms play in that increased chaos, you could call that gun chaos. And if you create a compound term, you know, out of the result of gun ownership restrictions and firearm ownership prohibitions and restrictions, then you'd have to call that gun chaos then. That is the ultimate outcome of that. And so keep in mind also that gun control is theoretically applying to a highly theoretical outcome, not an instantaneous result the instant that their laws get passed from these little shits in Parkland. So, you know that the gun prohibitions would be enacted, and then the ultimate outcome would be chaos. And but preceding that chaos, there would be increased control of some kind. So let's take the other part of that compound term and see what that portion of the compound term, how that portion that does actually map to reality would be affected by gun ownership restrictions. Well, then we're talking about slave control, right? Because the founding fathers, and going all the way back to British kings before the Magna Carta, freemen were allowed to own firearms to defend themselves. You know, this actually, you know, this is even in the transition to firearms. You know, there was initially a law in ancient England that required people to carry bows and arrows to church so that England couldn't be invaded while everybody was at church, so that armies couldn't just pour in across their borders and take control of everybody when people were disarmed and singing at church. So, you know, that's kind of an interesting, you know, piece of historical knowledge. And as far as slave control goes, you know, all of the firearm laws in this country started out disarming blacks in the South. And they were disarmed because they were chattel slaves at the time. And there's an excellent documentary. If you actually want the historical knowledge and you actually want to know how the Second Amendment arose and, you know, to what extent historically and even currently it's relevant, it's called In Search of the Second Amendment by David Hardy. And if you put that into a YouTube search box, it'll come right back, In Search of the Second Amendment. So let's not have any slave control, people.